Just about every game uses a menu of some kind, but does every game need a menu? Lethal Company, for example, has almost no menus. Besides having one for settings like graphics and controls, Lethal Company instead opts to replace traditional menus with in-game interactions. Things like using a chunky, old-school CRT monitor to purchase items, control the ship, and send your crew very mature and appropriate messages. Lethal Company itself is a game where you go into space with friends and travel to desolate moons in order to collect random appliances and toys from abandoned facilities, all for the sake of your unending dedication to the company. The twist is that these moons you travel to are kind of haunted, and everything wants to kill you.
Oh, that was kind of spooky sounding.
On top of this, the world of Lethal Company is like if space travel advanced really rapidly, but only using the tech from the 80s, and your employer is a literal monster.
Sorry that guy killed you, but that's how capitalism goes.
I don't know how else to describe this bizarre setting other than it sounds like something that came straight out of Japan. It wouldn't surprise me if there's already an anime in the works called My Space Monster Boss Will Eat Me Alive if I don't generate enough profit using only my fax machine. Anyways, you might be asking yourself, why does this game use this archaic tech to do all these simple actions over something like a menu? If you've wandered the moons of Lethal Company without that thought ever crossing your mind, that's a good thing. It means the design of Lethal Company is working as intended and you're immersed into its world. Although it didn't have to be this way. It probably would have been far easier and more efficient to use a more traditional menu to do many of the actions in Lethal Company. But that's not really the point. So let's take a closer look to understand what's going on here. As previously mentioned, to control anything in the ship, you must first access this hacker-like terminal screen. From here, you can input commands that range from autopiloting to a new planet to buying items from the shop. Here you can purchase things like extension ladders and shovels to help with your escapades, or do some accidental murder. Now you might be thinking, isn't this basically still a menu? The point here isn't that there shouldn't be menu-like things in games, but instead how we interact with menus in games needs to change. The computer menu in Lethal Company feels as if it's part of the game world, and not some sort of layer on top. Comparatively, a more traditional menu out of something like Final Fantasy might be your entire screen, and you'll scroll through the depths of it just to equip a new item. Lethal Company implements every mechanic to be something that is part of the game world. Even your tutorial is on a multi-page clipboard that can be picked up, flipped through, closely inspected, and sold if you so choose. But why does this matter? What's the point of blurring the lines between game and menu? Well, it all comes down to the game being more immersive, as well as the charm it adds just makes Lethal Company more enjoyable to play. So let's explore why this immersion and charm is worth the dedication it takes to make a better menu, and what it might look like in other games. When you open a menu or really perform any action that isn't within the game world, this pulls you further from the experience. And the more time we spend interacting with something that doesn't feel like it's a part of the game world, the less immersed we're going to feel. But more immersion typically leads to a much more interesting game. So then it only makes sense to try and obliterate actions that would cause players to detach from the experience. But in a lot of modern games, this doesn't happen. Way too many games still rely on boring traditional menus to make ends meet. These kinds of menus are an overused relic of a bygone era where we didn't have the proper structures and resources to create a more immersive experience. Early Final Fantasy games used menus like these to manage nearly everything from your party and characters to your inventory and skill trees. Most menu actions in these games could have been layered more neatly into the game world itself, but at the cost of far more development time and resources. But despite our advances in what games can do, some developers have had a tough time getting away from these menus. A menu is a convenience, and in my opinion should only be used for actions that are incredibly repetitive and need to be done very often, or are impossible to make immersive. When I think of something in a game where a menu is almost always necessary, it's usually something like inventory management. And of course, menus can be beneficial for things that aren't related to the game world, such as volume, but this isn't a concrete rule. Even something as inconsequential as game volume could be designed to be more immersive. For example, Persona 5 heavily uses the phone as a menu to immerse you. There could have been an added option here somewhere to make the game volume adjustable while your phone is out. Seeing your character press down the volume button on their phone as the music softens would be deeply immersive. This also removes a layer of menus that would have instead peeled the player away from the world. Now, I wouldn't say this is the best way to implement game volume because it's a bit clunky and oddly placed, and really, how often would you be changing the game volume that it needs to be that accessible? But the point I'm trying to get across is that every action that uses a menu could instead be integrated into the game world itself. While this can be far less efficient and more of a hassle to use, it immerses players. It's a trade-off, or a potential sacrifice of something like ease of use or efficiency to keep players grounded in the game world. But the sacrifice doesn't need to be enormous. If designed well, the value received in immersion by moving away from a more traditional menu can far outweigh the downsides. I think most would agree that the more immersed you are into a game, the better that game feels to play. And this is exactly why Lethal Company's design works so well. Well then, what about traditional menus that are really good? For instance, coming back to Persona 5, it has some of the best menu design out of any game, period. It's not the first time I'll talk about this, and probably not the last, because the menu design in Persona 5 is just phenomenal. Even using the general start menu feels fun to use with its sleek animations and quick responsiveness. And we can't forget to mention how good the menus even during battles feel to use. But one design that I think would make Persona's menus even better would be to move its social links menu into some sort of diary that you keep on you. In the Persona games, a large part of them is talking with all the different characters, hearing their stories and helping them with their problems. Persona is played through many different days, and keeping track of all the people you need to talk to can quickly become a chaotic nightmare to organize. The social links menu includes some details about everyone you've created bonds with, but isn't the greatest tool for helping you actually manage anything. We could instead have a diary that you open up and use in game. Opening it up would show you what your status with each person is, when you last decided to spend time with them, maybe what your last conversation was about, and also what days they are typically available. All of this is really important information in managing your social links. Each character could then have their own sections that you flip between and are separated by something like a marked tab to make it feel like you're using an actual diary or notebook. This kind of design is more akin to what is actually happening in Lethal Company, because designing a menu to be a part of the game world often just makes for a much better experience. But let's maybe take a look at a trade-off that would be much more controversial. One example I can think of is something like healing your party inside a dungeon. In Persona, this would involve removing an action from a menu that could result in a huge sacrifice in efficiency for immersion. Even though this is something that could be removed from a menu entirely, would it be worth it? In Persona, you carry around items that allow you to summon a variety of demons. To simplify this for those unfamiliar with the series, these demons, or personas, are a lot like Pokemon, in the sense that they help you fight enemies, you have many of them, and that they also have types and weaknesses. Continuing this Pokemon analogy, the game uses a tarot card system that holds these personas, which kind of work like Pokeballs. Although you don't really use the tarot cards to capture the personas, it's more of just a way to hold many of them at one time. Now that we totally get how Persona works, and some Persona fan out there probably hates me personally because I said it's just like Pokemon, let's come back to this idea of removing the act of healing your party outside of combat from a menu. Normally, you access your list of personas through the main menu, and then from here you can inspect them and set an active one. In the main menu, you can also choose an ability data like Dia or Media, and this will heal your party from outside of combat. While this is easy to understand and use, it's not very immersive. I think something that would be more interesting would be accessing our personas by pulling out the cards we currently have and showing them in our hands. So instead of going through the main menu, we would click a button to have the card show up at the bottom of the screen and have a quick animation of the cards fanning out like we're about to send someone to the Shadow Realm. From here, you should be able to scroll through each card, showing the persona on the front, and be able to flip them to see their stats on the back. And then while looking at the card, there should be a tiny menu that allows you to use some of their abilities out of combat, like their healing spells. If one of them is used, it could show a quick animation of your persona using the ability and healing your target. This creates a far more immersive experience by keeping us out of a menu and attaching us to what our characters are currently doing in the game world. This might sacrifice some efficiency and ease of use, but I think the benefits gained from the immersion would be well worth whatever the cost is. I think it's possible some players would potentially revolt against this if it took too much longer to heal your party out of combat than it does now, but I think this can be easily mitigated, as long as it's designed in a way that keeps healing quick and efficient while staying immersive. So then where's the line with this kind of design? When can we get value by sacrificing immersion to gain efficiency? Again, inventories often come to mind when I think of things that are tough to design outside of a menu. Imagine accessing your inventory in Baldur's Gate 3 by needing to pull out a giant bag of holding, and then you have to dump everything on the ground in front of you to find what you want. And then of course, putting it all back in the bag when you're done. Okay, yeah, that's a bit extreme and would probably be a horrible design despite how immersive it might be. Although I think you can make inventory management more immersive without being as atrocious as my example. But in games like Final Fantasy or Baldur's Gate, where you collect a polluted ocean's worth of items, some sort of menu-like operation to sort through them effectively becomes essential. Although we can still add immersion to an inventory menu without removing too much efficiency or making it a complete nuisance to use. Much like, again, how Lethal Company uses a traditional menu as a part of the game world, we can do something similar here. Imagine that instead of going through your average inventory menu, we instead pull out a backpack with many different pouches and slots, each with a label. These slots could then be scrolled to and be selected, each one holding different kinds of items. For example, we pull out the bag, there's some animation of our character doing this, and we scroll through the different sections. We could scroll to a pocket called medicine, and then the menu should pop up near it with a list of your healing items. This would only become an issue when you don't know exactly what kind of item something is, but whether or not that's a real issue is maybe a topic for another day. This kind of design would still be a menu, but a much more immersive one. It allows the game to stay somewhat efficient without totally pulling you out of the experience, although this only works well when you have a single inventory to manage. In a game like Baldur's Gate, things get a bit more complicated, and this new immersive bag would instead become a ridiculous hassle to manage between all your party members. And the annoyance this creates would likely be so large that it pulls you too far out of the experience to be truly immersive, much like my bag of holding example. Situations like inventory management between many characters are exactly what menus are for. More traditional menus are for solving problems that occur with mechanics that are necessary for your game to function but can be frustrating or annoying to do, so much so that it might detach you from the experience. Like actions that we do way too many times and feel like they take an overwhelming amount of time to do. I think one action like this that exists in Baldur's Gate is getting companions to either stay at your camp or join your party. It's something that feels overly tedious, and the immersion gained from it doesn't really feel worth it.
Oh, darling, I'm hurt.
This could have been designed to be much less strenuous while hardly losing any immersion. My solution to this would probably be to have everyone be in the party while at camp. This way you can have control over each character without needing to go through the hassle of removing and adding them, as well as having the power to choose whether or not they are in the main party, maybe with something like separating their portraits into 2 groups, and then on top of this you could easily have access to every character's inventory on a single screen. And this would solve a lot of the camp issues with inventories and general party management. Ultimately, games need to be more careful when considering what is truly immersive. Otherwise, they are at risk of designing something that would make the overall game experience worse, even if it sounds good in theory. On paper, talking to your teammates seems like it should be a more immersive way to manage your party than going through a menu, pressing a button, or swapping a portrait around. But if all you can think about while talking to your companion to swap them out with someone else is how annoying it is, then the immersion has been broken. This shouldn't lead us astray from trying to remove menus and create different kinds of immersive interactions, but instead think more about what is actually an immersive feeling and what isn't. Designing an immersive experience correctly is all about looking from the right perspective. To riff on that idea a little more, how immersive does it feel to drink a potion after every fight? If a single action is repeated all the time is kind of boring and is also kind of difficult to make immersive outside of a menu, when does it become appropriate to start pruning that action from the game? Square Enix sort of took on this design idea of pruning actions like buying and using potions in Final Fantasy XIII. You never have to think about the state of your party's HP or mana outside of a battle, and it's pretty nice. Although potions aren't completely absent, they are never used outside of combat. 13 may not be the best example when it comes to having an immersive experience, but it's not as if they didn't have any good ideas. Pruning actions that are too abundant and boring, like healing items, generally helps to create a better experience. Again, it's not an uncommon occurrence to be opening the menu after every fight to heal up your party in some RPGs. And of course, the more often we have to do this, the more often we become removed from the experience. I'm not saying this design of pruning potions is perfect or ideal, rather it's a step in the right direction. Although we do have to be careful. Removing things like healing outside of fights changes the foundations of how your combat will work. It's a decision that can't be taken lightly. especially if the combat is heavily designed around some sort of resource management. So pruning actions to this extent might not always be the best idea. It will heavily vary from game to game and be highly dependent on the systems within them. And if it can't be pruned, we'll just need a different way to make that action more immersive, like the Persona Tarot cards example. A different way to prune the use of menus might be by removing ease of use to certain systems that are accessed too easily and too often, with the goal being to stop the player from overusing the menu. You can remove things like a game's power-up system from the main menu, and instead force the player to interact with something in the world to use that system. That was really vague, but I'll explain. Let's take a look at the sphere grid system in Final Fantasy X, for example. This system, like most things in the menu, could be totally removed and be placed into the game world itself. Access to the sphere grid could be placed in every inn or another place in town. There could be a big pedestal that manifests the sphere grid and then lets you power up. This heavily removes the convenience of being able to level up your party whenever you would like and sacrifices a significant amount of ease of use. But it would make you look forward to using the sphere grid and make it feel more intentional, as well as the gains you would get from powering it up would be much more noticeable each time. Ultimately, the goal being to spend less time opening and closing the menu. At the end of the day, getting rid of menus entirely is probably impossible. I may have been exaggerating a little when calling for the death of all menus in the title, but I do think it would be ideal to tone down how often we access and use systematic menus as much as possible. Many things that are made into menus can be replaced or masked to be an interaction in-game. Even if what you're using is basically a menu with a facelift, how immersive these menus feel will be dependent on how well they're designed, and keeping the player more immersed will always lead to a better game. Anyways, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.